maybe start with a little bit of a history lesson here as we hear again from the Acts of the Apostles. As Paul and his companions are making their way on this missionary journey, they come to the place of Philippi, the city of Philippi, the region of Philippi, which was a pretty major Roman colony. And as a Roman colony, it would have had predominantly a Roman population, including likely many retired legionnaires, soldiers, but very few Jewish believers. And so even as they come and stay there for a while, it says on that Sabbath, they went outside the city gate along the river where they thought there would be a place of prayer. Because, again, likely there were so few Jewish believers, practitioners in the city of Philippi, they didn't have a synagogue. There was no synagogue. They didn't have necessarily the money or the influence or maybe even the need to build a synagogue specifically to gather for prayer. So they go out along the river, likely so that they could, use the flowing water of the river as some of that Jewish purification and washing things as part of their prayers. And they go out there to join them in their prayer and meet Lydia, who is a dealer in purple cloth and as such likely rather wealthy. And she is described as a worshiper of God. She believes in what the Jewish prayers and the God of the Jews, the God of creation, but she's not necessarily been fully converted to Judaism. And as she listens, the Lord opens her heart. She comes to believe, and she and her entire household are baptized. And then she makes that invitation. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, come and stay at my home. And again, likely being wealthy, she probably had a decent-sized house with a pretty decent estate. And she impresses upon them, and they go and stay with her. And as such, her home likely becomes that early gathering place for Christians, for believers in Jesus Christ in the city of Philippi. It becomes a home church kind of thing. And again, like most of those Roman homes, it would have likely had a rather large atrium, a good place to gather and to pray. And as reminder again, Paul is first preaching this there, and so the number of believers would have been small and easily able to gather in her home for probably quite a while. But it is also, I think, important to note that as we look at that history and some of that beginnings of the church, we remember that the church needed to grow. The church, Christians, Catholicism did not begin, fully formed with basilicas and massive amounts of people coming to churches. It had to start somewhere. And just like, again, the Jews didn't have necessarily a place in Philippi, neither did the Christians. And they made do with what worked and what was available. And whether it was meeting by the river or in the home of Lydia, they make do. And as we acknowledge that, I think it is then maybe a little helpful to remember that just because that's the way it was done in the early church doesn't necessarily mean that's the way it should always be done. And I find it interesting, in maybe a negative connotation way of interesting, of hearing a number of Christians and even some Catholics who purport to say, well, we should go back and do things the way they did in the early church, in the days of the apostles, and we should do things like they did and go back to that origin and how it used to be done. And I think that view or that image is really a disservice to history. And again, not to say that what they did was wrong or bad necessarily, but to say that those things that they did and, the worshiping in the house churches and these other things, a lot of it was done out of necessity because they didn't have dedicated worship spaces. But we should also remember that history, that as soon as they did have that influence, as soon as they did have that number of believers, as soon as they did have, again, more people and more contributions to buy and build churches, beautiful gathering spaces, they moved out of the church homes, the home churches, and into those dedicated worship spaces, because they saw that as being a better fit. It made more sense than that home church mentality. And to say simply, well, let's go back and do home churches like they did in there, where they gathered for the Lord's Supper, where they gathered for the Mass, where they gathered for the breaking of the bread, it's, I think, putting on blinders and not seeing that full depth of history and of the progression and the reasons and the limitations for those different moments and the different ways that things operated. Because there are, again, many other ways where this mentality is still promoted, even in our day and age. You get, again, Christians and Catholics who want to go back to some of the ways that things were done in those early church days. And even something as simple as like the bread we use at Mass. Say, well, the apostles never would have used, the wafer, the bread that we use now. They would have used, more things that were actually baked in ovens and would have been, again, likely, leavened bread or, not risen bread, but still more similar to naan or some other kind of bread. And so why don't we use that at Mass? And you get some places even there where they will use that kind of thing, or other Christian denominations will move towards that direction. And sure, again, it's not necessarily bad or wrong to do so, but I think it is failing to recognize all the depths of history and to say there is a reason that the church kind of went to this model of the wafer, because the church recognizes Christ present in every particle of the Eucharist. And those loaves or those breads, as you break them or as you have to, again, tear or break or pull off pieces of it, leaves a lot of crumbs. And it leaves a lot of pieces, and it leaves a lot to be cleaned up, or that potential for those crumbs to fall upon the ground or to be dropped in the hand or maybe missed, or again, then Christ himself falling upon the floor or being trampled upon. Not ideal. And the church, as soon as it was able, as soon as it had that ability and the technology, said, let us do it more like this, where you have fewer crumbs, where you can distribute a little bit more cleanly without having to do the fracture or the breaking all the time. And to say, this seems like it's a good fit. Again, not to say that the other way is wrong or that this way doesn't have its own limitations, but to say, what is that development? What is that history? And not to simply say, well, let's do it the way it used to be done, without recognizing that, yeah, maybe they would have done it differently if they could have too. Or to say they were doing what they needed to do with the resources they had at the time. But that the development in these things is and can be and should be recognized as a good thing too. And again, sometimes as things develop, sometimes we say, well, things have changed and we're going to adjust it again. And sometimes we might adjust it back more towards how it used to look. And that's not bad either. But to not put on the blinders and only focus on one era or one time or one situation, but to see all of the reasons, all of the development, all of the growth that is meant to happen, and to see it as a whole before we make decisions. And again, this involves so many aspects of the church, and you see it, like I said, in many other Christian denominations as well, who want to reject some of the things of the Catholic Church. But it is also important for us as we consider even some of those important things, like the way we receive communion itself. But that is perhaps a topic for another day.